Assalamu alaikum everyone. Thank you for coming to our talk today. We're going to be talking about free will and predestination in Islam. We're very lucky to have Dr. Ramon Harvey delivering this lecture for us. He's a lecturer at Cambridge Muslim College and also Aziz Foundation Lecturer in Islamic Studies at Ibrahim College. And also very interestingly, he's looking to write a book potentially on this topic at some point. So I have a lot of very useful insights to give and outlooks on philosophies free will in Islam. So yeah, without any further ado,
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah. It's an honor to be invited to present to you today on this topic. I'll do my best. I'm just to update my affiliation. I'm full-time at Cambridge Muslim College. I was previously at Ibrahim College. The thoughts from here draw from a chapter, I would say, in a book that I plan to write in the future. And so this talk, in a way, is helping me get an outline of some things I want to say in that regard. So hopefully that will be a benefit. So I've been asked to speak about this thorniest of topics from an Islamic perspective. And what follows, as I said, I anticipate some aspects of some work I want to write about properly in the future. This is a classical theological conundrum, and there are only so many ways, I think, that free will and predestination can be tackled. And many of these may be familiar to you, if not from Islam, perhaps through Christianity, of which it's been a very prominent topic as well. And this is because both of the religions share the same basic tension that we'll be looking at. The idea of God's omnipotence or sovereignty as against human free will, which is usually held to underwrite moral accountability. And this fundamental tension, it's sometimes considered to be insoluble or to be just a paradox you have to accept. And today I want to suggest that it can be unraveled in some ways, rationally speaking. So to start us off, I want to read out a hadith. And this is a hadith where we perhaps even find a almost playful acceptance of the difficulty between the two ideas. So in the hadith in Al-Bukhari, in the chapter on Qadar, Abu Huraira narrates that the Prophet, may God bless him and grant him peace, said, Adam and Moses disputed with each other. Moses said to him, "O Adam, you are our father who let us down and brought us out of paradise." So Adam replied, "O Moses, God chose you for his speech and wrote the Torah for you with his hand. Do you blame me for a matter that God decreed for me 40 years before he created me?" So Adam overcame Moses. And the Prophet repeated this 3 times. So Adam overcame Moses. So Adam overcame Moses. So Adam and Moses, I would suggest, are not so much in personal dispute here as is free will represented by Adam's mistake and fate as represented by the decree before his creation. The Hadith corpus is replete with similar narrations, which seem to give a dominant role to the decree, even if there is some acceptance of the experience of freedom. So, for example, we have the Hadith of Ibn Mas'ud, which is in the collection of An-Nawawi, the 40 Hadith, that an angel writes the provision, lifespan, actions, and final destination of a soul when it is first breathed into the human being in the womb. And then that person can come within an arm span of either paradise or hell until what is written overtakes them and they begin doing the actions of the other place and finally enter into that place. So all the schools of thought that accept the Sunni Hadith corpus will at the minimum seek to preserve the decree, the idea of qadr, and at the most make it prescriptive. And what I mean by making the decree prescriptive is to actually resolve this tension, as it were, in favor of the decree, head of free will, or at least arguably so. If this is the case, how could a serious intellectual argument be made by any Muslim theologian for a resolution on the side of free will? To say, well, actually, free will is what dominates, or should be taken. An idea of an answer can be found by considering the first hadith in Sahih Muslim. Here, it is reported that a figure known as Ma'bad al-Juhani, who died in 82 after Hijrah 704, from Basra, had started to speak about the decree. Those who had heard this had gone on Hajj or on Umrah, and they had come across Abdullah ibn Umar, the son of Umar ibn al-Khattab, radiallahu anhu. And Abdullah ibn Umar told them that he was free of such people who would speak about the decree, i.e., who would question the decree. And they were free of him. And furthermore, if they spent gold as much as Mount Uhud in God's path, it would not be accepted from them, their charity, until they affirmed the decree. And this becomes, in the Hadith at the beginning of Sahih Muslim, a framing device for the famous Hadith of Jibril alayhi salam, in which Jibril comes to the Prophet as a stranger and asks him these questions about Iman and Islam, and when he and the last Ihsan and the last day. And when he asks him about Iman, the Prophet answers that Iman is that you believe in God, His angels, His books, His messengers, the last day, and believe in the decree, it's good and ill. But if we compare this hadith, and this is one of the very well-known hadiths that really give the kind of core, central understanding of Iman and Islam, and everyone is taught this hadith. But if we compare this to a verse in the Quran, to the 136th verse of Surah An-Nisa, we find there, whoever disbelieves in God, His angels, His books, His messengers, and the last day, then he has strayed far away. The divine decree is not explicitly mentioned in the Quran, right? In that sort of parallel situation, which is interesting to say the least. And what you actually will find in the Quran is that there is a fine balance with texts that both seem to affirm predestination and others that preserve freedom. So, I'm going to give you some examples. So, in Surah An'am, we find He has the keys to the unseen. No one knows them but Him. He knows all that is in the land and sea. No leaf falls without His knowledge, nor is there a single grain in the darkness of the earth, or anything fresh or withered that is not written in a clear record. Obviously speaking about Allah. In Surah Safat, verse 96, God created you and what you do. And in 81:29, you do not will except that God wills. So all these verses, at least on the outward, suggest that the creation as a whole is entirely within the knowledge and will of God and conforms completely to His decree. But on the other hand, those who want to take a different perspective may want to respond and argue for free will. And they can, as well as using the entire discourse of the Quran and the moral idea of moral responsibility, they may seek verses such as 1044. God does not wrong people at all. It is they who wrong themselves. Or 25:57. Say, I am not asking for any reward for it, but anyone who wishes should take a path to his Lord. And 16:35. Those who worshipped others alongside God say, if God had willed, we would not have worshipped anything but Him, nor would our fathers. We would not have declared anything forbidden without His sanction. Those before them said the same. And just to explain that last one, this is the disbelievers, who the Prophet or the prophets are encountering, and then they are criticized for using the idea of God's will as an excuse not to worship Him. If God had wanted, we would have worshipped. And Allah is saying, well, those before them said the same thing. And so implicitly, it can be inferred that this, could be inferred this is a rejection of predestination. Now, all of these different verses could be given an appropriate interpretation according to either side of the debate. Any verse can be taken and interpreted within a certain framework of thought, within a theological position. And so really, although what they say is fairly clear, how they are to be interpreted on a theological level remains difficult and remains open to debates and discussions. And so what we can start to perhaps see is that with this interpretive diversity within the Quran as the core scripture, and with some dispute about hadith, even if in the sense that certain groups would be liable to not accept certain hadith or to doubt them, and for the hadith to take some time to be canonized within the traditions, what you can see is there is the possibility, and it was actually a historical reality, that a tendency emerged in early centuries of Islam that did emphatically reject the idea of predestination. And this is called Qadrism. And so Qadrism is not a school of thought, as a theological school. Qadrism is a tendency of thought. It's a particular strong position held on this question of the decree, which could actually, you could be a Qadri and something else, right? And another school of thought. And the most famous and the most strong association here was with the Mu'tazila, right? But you didn't have to be a Mu'tazila to be a Qadri, because Qadri is someone in this context who is rejecting the idea of the decree. And it was theorized in various ways, but the main point here is that humans were free to carry out their own actions, especially in context of the bad ones. And this was particularly for the Mu'tazila. They were very concerned that they didn't want to attribute any kind of bad actions or sins or disbelief to the will of God, because that would, in their view, imply an injustice, that God is doing injustice, and they rejected that idea. Of course, others disagreed with that construal. And as well as Ma'bad, who was obviously the person in Basra who we mentioned, there were others in the early centuries who brought up these kind of ideas, such as Abu Marwan, Ghaylan ibn Muslim. And there was allegations made there were some of these figures were influenced by Christian or Manichaean ideas. And actually both Ma'bad and Abu Marwan both of them were executed by the Umayyad state. And this points to a political dimension to the controversy. Basically, the Umayyad dynasty were strongly in favor of the idea of the decree, because they felt that it bolstered their own claim to be the rightful rulers of the time. And many felt that many rebelled against the Umayyads, or felt that the Umayyads were unjust. And their response was that, well, if we were not meant to be in power, then God would not have placed us in power. And they used, in some sense, the divine decree for this political end. Now, that kind of context may help to explain the letter written by the Umayyad Caliph Abdul Malik, who reigned between 65 and 86 Hijrah, obviously, roughly the same time as Ma'bad. And he apparently questioned the teacher and ascetic and very famous early Muslim Al-Hasan al-Basri for holding beliefs about the divine decree that were different from those before him. And there's a short treatise that Al-Hasan allegedly composed in reply. Now, what this treatise basically does is defend human free will overall. Now, there's much debate in the literature over whether this treatise is genuinely attributable to Hassan. And like earlier texts at the time, it's hard to be sure. It's one of these kind of early theological recital that we have, and we're not sure. For sure, some have argued that it could be a later Zaydi forgery from the Zaydi, the Shi'i group. And the reason for this is that some of the groups in later history would want to support the kind of doctrine that he's putting forward here in the Risala. And there's also discussion over what the meaning of his words are. I'm not going to go into any sort of detail, but I would suggest that the position that he takes, which highlights the divine decree as grounded in God's knowledge of human choice, this actually perhaps anticipates views held by figures such as the Hanafi Maturidis. I'm going to come on to that group later, ahead of the idea of acquisition, kasb, which is held by the Asharis. So we'll come on to some of it, but there's if this is an genuinely early text, it probably anticipates later debates, although it doesn't settle them. So we're beginning to see that we're faced with a problem, and we can deal with it in various ways. And I'm going to start to shift from a kind of more historical take to a more sort of philosophical and theological discussion of the topic. So what options do we have for dealing with this question of free will and the decree or predestination? We can substantially resolve it in one or other direction. So we can resolve it in a direction of divine sovereignty, or we can resolve it in a direction of human freedom and, arguably morality. But if we do so, we will risk losing the other elements, and both of them are very important. Or perhaps we can preserve it as an unresolved paradox and just let it hang in place as a mystery, that we must affirm both, We don't understand how they're related, and maybe we don't need to know. And some people do take this view, and it's a legitimate response to the situation. It may be preferable, in fact, to abandoning either of the principles, but I would suggest it's not intellectually satisfying, and that is why there continue to be efforts made to try to find a rational way, a theological way to actually get to a resolution of these two elements that seem to be in tension. And this is what I want to look at in more detail below. So, in an article written on predestination and free will, the Christian philosopher of religion, Bruce Reichenbach, aptly compares the problem to the strewn pieces of a puzzle that we try to put together. There are various pieces to take account of, each with its own unique features and relationship to each other. Can we find a way to put them together, and are we satisfied with the resulting picture? So I want to look at some of the elements that we might need to consider to think about this question in a bit more depth. So first, we have the nature and attributes of God, in particular, divine will, knowledge, wisdom, and a relationship to time. All of these are important. And the general tenor of the treatment that I will give, or of anyone who wants to try to make this kind of resolution, is to show that God's perfection is preserved while granting room for human freedom. And then we also have the human being. And the crucial ideas in relation to the human are the nature of free will and the causal theory of human action within a temporal existence. And here there's the same pull, but this time towards preserving human freedom while granting God's qualities. What should be clear is that we need to hold both of the actors, divine and human, in mind as we attempt a delicate theological task. As a first pass, I will discuss God, and then I will turn to the human being. So I want to articulate some essential features of the divine attributes within the framework of Sunni Kalam, or Sunni theology, which is the tradition I'm most familiar with. And up to this day, obviously, it's been the historically dominant trend for Muslims, at least in terms of Sunnism as a whole, and in particularly the theological tradition, particularly the Ash'ari school and the Maturidi school of thought. And as a tradition, it commits itself to the decree, as we've seen from the Hadith that I've mentioned. So it has the biggest task of reconciliation to do, compared, for example, with those strands of thought that draw more centrally on the legacy of the Mu'tazila, such as Shiism. And it's maybe familiar to you that the Mu'tazilism, as after the first early centuries of Islam, it starts to die out within Sunni, and Sunni Kalam actually strongly argues against it. Both Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari was a Mu'tazili from the Basran school who turned against Mu'tazilism and argued for a position closer to the Sunni traditionalists, and Abu Mansur al-Maturidi in Samarkand was strongly, part of the Hanafi tradition, was strongly invested in arguing against the so-called Baghdadi Mu'tazilism as represented by al-Ka'bi, who was active in his area. So you see this strong, and then of course from the Hanbali school of thought, there was a strong reaction against Mu'tazilism and the Mihna. It's an early historical event connected with the idea whether the Quran is created or not, which is not going to come into our discussion. But I'm going to focus more on these two Sunni schools of thought. Now, when it comes to the Shi'i tradition, what happens is that Imami Shi'ism and Zaydi Shi'ism substantially embrace ideas of Mu'tazilism, but shaping it within their own context. And so my discussion for the remainder of the paper that I'm presenting here, or lecture, will be on the Ash'ari and Maturidi schools of thought within Sunni Kalam. So remember, these schools of thought do accept there is a reality to the decree. They affirm the decree as a part of faith, but want to explain it and not lose free will. Can they do this? How do they do this? And what can we say today? I want to look at divine knowledge, will, and power. So these are attributes that are affirmed by perfections by both schools of thought. God knows everything that can be known, wills everything that actually comes to exist, and has power over all possibilities. Further, God is atemporally eternal, he's timeless. He exists timelessly, and so even if the world is a sequence of temporal becoming, the world has a timeline through which we experience, God is outside of this timeline. God is not within time. God creates time. However, we don't understand that. God does not experience the world as we do, but that does not mean that he lacks an understanding of how we experience it. In fact, he's created it and knows everything about it. But our limited temporal perspectives, we could say, in a rough way, are all a subset of what he knows. And if the schools agree on the above, they also have some disagreements. Most famously, the Maturidis treat the divine actions, most notably God's creating, as eternal, although having their effects within time. And also, according to the earlier Maturidis, and I've written about this at length in my most recent book, divine wisdom, hikmah, is an attribute separate from knowledge or will, and it provides a kind of internal constraint on action, we could say. God must do certain things by virtue of his own wisdom. It's not an external condition such as the Mu'tazila would hold on God's action, but it's an internal condition that God is wise and will always act according to his own wisdom. And we'll see what difference falls out of this presently. With that, I want to come to the human being. What are we? We are temporally bound creatures and possess our own knowledge, will, power, and even sometimes wisdom, but in an incomparably lesser fashion. The Asharis and Maturidis agree that the human being has an experience of free choice, and this can be contrasted with involuntary actions. So I want you to just consider your breathing. Up until now, during this talk, you were no doubt breathing. I hope everyone was breathing, and without thinking about it. Now that I've mentioned it, you are likely starting to become aware of the possibility of voluntarily taking in or out your breath. If your attention drifts, you will fall back again into involuntary breathing. So we need to be able to take account for this choice to breathe, to not to breathe, to hold one's breath or not, or do anything else, including the kind of moral actions that concern us. And to do this, we're going to have to get a little more theologically technical, so please forgive me. We will need to talk about theories of action, and these must be couched within specific causal theories. So I want to first talk about the main causal theory within classical Sunni Kalam, which is dominant within the Ash'ari school, and it's held by most of the later Maturidis, or becomes dominant within the Maturidi school as well, but not, I argue, some of the earlier figures in that tradition, including the eponym Abu Mansur Maturidi. And this theory is called occasionalism in contemporary discussion. And now, occasionalism, this name is famously associated with the French theologian Nicolas Malebranche, who died in 1715. But it was developed close to 1,000 years earlier by Muslim theologians and popularized by the school of Ash'ari. Later, it was adopted by almost all the Maturidis, and it became associated with Sunni orthodoxy. So you would often hear that occasionalism is synonymous with Sunnism. Occasionalism is animated by the idea that only God can be, properly speaking, called a cause. Everything that happens within the world and that seems to be of a causal nature, say a stone, let's imagine a stone hitting a window, and the window shatters. This seems to be a cause and effect relationship. It seems to be that the stone is causing the window to shatter. But in reality, according to occasionalism, this is solely and only God creating discrete moments from outside of our timeline. And we can imagine how he does this, that he lets the stone fly towards, we can imagine the stone flying towards the window in slow motion. And at the very moment that God of shattering, God replaces an intact window with a shattered one. There is no causal power in the stone whatsoever. If God wanted, according to occasionalism, he could create these moments in a different order. For example, the stone could fly at a shattered window and it would appear to cause it to fall into a whole one. The only reason that we never see this is that God is utterly consistent in his habit, his adah, his way of doing things in the world. But there is no causal reality or potency to anything in the creative order. And if this is sounding quite Humean, if it sounds like the ideas promoted by David Hume, then yes, it does anticipate some of his famous arguments about causation. This way of thinking is remarkably self-consistent. By strongly upholding the principle of divine regularity, it means that everything that we think of as laws of nature can be accounted for. So it doesn't stop us talking about laws of nature, but the laws of nature are just the way that God happens to do things, and it doesn't have to be that way. There's nothing actually necessary about it. It's just how God has, without fail, made his creation run. And it's attractive for explaining that the world, exactly as it is the result of God's will and power, and also being able to account for miracles within religious thought. What are miracles according to occasionalism? Well, they're just the very odd occasions that God does not follow his usual habits. God, there's nothing actually anymore, there's nothing actually different in any way of God creating something miraculous or just creating the regular things. It's just that God very, very rarely does the miraculous things. But our interest here is in free will. And in free will, the view can raise some quite acute problems. If one is a thoroughgoing occasionalist, then God is the only cause for everything. This also means, of course, that God causes human acts. God causes everything, so God causes actions. Now, the model does not allow for causal potency within the world, so how can we think about how God will act or create human acts according to occasionalism? Well, what the theologians say is that God creates a quality of power. You know, if you use the word accident, but you can just call it a quality, that the human agent has a quality of power. And at the very moment the human being acts, God gives the human being a power, and the power, and simultaneously the power is used, spent, and God simultaneously creates the action that is chosen by the human will. But the power can only be used for the action that it is created for, and does not in fact have any effect. So what we have here is God creates the power, God creates the effect of the power, and the power can only be spent for the effect. And so what this actually means, and then and therefore, according to this kind of model of occasionalism, the human being's act has been now earned, right? Because the human being, and the example that's given is that we know the difference between what we do voluntarily and what we do involuntarily, and the things that we do voluntarily, they're the things that we are given this power, and we've earned the acts that we thereby do. Now, the problem with this, at least in my mind, is that the sense of the feeling of freeness when we do whatever we do, would appear to have no more reality than the stone appearing to shatter the window. The same kind of case. It just seems that way. It looks like it's a real free act, but it's not actually free in any sense, because it's exactly what God has already decreed to happen. And in fact, that power that is given in the moment of action actually can only be used for that decreed action that it will inevitably result in. And so thus it's famously been said that Cyril Casper-Jabber, the secret of acquisition is determinism. And many great theologians have actually voiced their concerns that although this is a system that very much preserves God's power and will, it does seem to be lacking in terms of really accounting for freedom in any real sense. It just seems to be a kind of psychological or apparent freedom. And so perhaps, even though we've attempted to hold both in place, our two elements of our tension, perhaps we've actually fundamentally resolved the conundrum on the side of determinism. And in this respect, the particular theory can in some ways be compared to the predestination of Calvinism. Now, some attempts were made in later periods to rectify the obvious drawbacks that I'm mentioning. One, and so the tradition, in particular the Asheri tradition and the Maturides later on, were aware of some of these problems. And so one of these makes use of the strange ontological status of relations. If we think about the idea of the laptop is on the podium, referring to my laptop here, we can understand, so we're thinking about this relation on, the laptop is on the podium. We can understand the relation between these two concrete objects has no real existence, but supervenes upon them. Because of where God has created these exact two things, this relation obtains. But the relation itself is not created by God, just these objects. So they're just, in reality, is just the podium and there's the laptop. And because the laptop occupies a space that it does, then we can call that the laptop being on the podium, but there's no ontology to on, it's a relation. Now, this argument is made, and I'm going to explain the relevance of this in a second. Perhaps our thought of the relation is created, but this is different than the relation itself. And if we were gone, presumably, in some sense, the laptop would be on the podium, even if we weren't thinking about it, but without the ontology of either. Can this help us with our free will gap? So the argument here would go that something like choosing human will is just the supervening relation between the created human being and the created act. And as a relation, it's not created, and thus can escape the charge that as a created thing, it must be under the causal determinism of the divine will. So the idea, just to say that again, maybe, is that we're now treating this choosing that the human being does, the idea would be to treat it as a relation, and so it's not actually an object of creation, and therefore it can kind of escape from the absolute determinism of everything according to occasionalism. Now, I don't know about you, but this idea strikes me as legerdemain. If the choosing will is relational, then it merely supervenes on the actual existing elements of the human being and the act that's created. However we want to see the human being, will, soul, mind, and the act of whatever is done. And if all of these are under God's sole cause or agency, then it seems impossible for the will to actually cause or choose anything. Like the relation of on between laptop and podium, it's a phantom based on the supervenience of other things, and these things are set by God. So apart from providing a more technical clarification of what is meant by casp or voluntary psychological states, I don't think it advances theologically from the earlier model. Perhaps there's one more move available for the committed occasionalists. We can posit that the choice occurs due to the influence of the soul, and the soul is a matter of our Lord, which we have been given little. Perhaps the soul, that's referencing sort of the Isra 85, perhaps the soul can be the missing piece of free will in a causally determined world. This unfortunately just pushes the same problem upstairs and makes use of the mystery of the soul as a smokescreen. According to the fundamentals of occasionalism, the soul, as a created entity, can have no causal potency. Whether material or immaterial, mysterious or well understood, there is no getting around that simple fact. And as far as I can tell, on occasionalism, one can get at most psychological free will. So I want to introduce an alternative model, and here I hope we can get a bit further in a solution. It does not mean that the road will be easy. There will still be difficulties ahead, but they'll be in different places and for different reasons. So rather than occasionalism, this model can be termed concurrentism. What follows is my reconstruction of the system of Abu Mansur al-Maturidi and likely his early successors in Samarkand before it seems that this kind of model was dropped by adoption of occasionalism. And this model posits real causal potency for creative things within the world without compromising on the principle that God's will and power over all things are absolute. So take our example of the stone in the window. God creates the window with the nature or disposition to shatter under certain conditions. Once those conditions are met, then the window shatters. It is not seamlessly replaced by shattered glass, nor is there the possibility that it just won't happen, given the conditions are there. But is this then a constriction of divine power or will? I say no, because it is within divine power for it to not occur. And this remains a possibility in terms of the logical options available to the divine will. But the difference is that divine wisdom underpins the necessity of causation under its conditions. This makes causation metaphysically necessary, rather than merely God's habit or custom. And this can be seen also in the way that Al-Maturidi deals with miracles. For him, they are exceptionally rare or unique natures of things within the causal world, rather than a suspension of God's habit. This should be enough to help us to characterize the concurrentist position on free choice, which is known as ikhtiyar. Here we have the same scenario of a human agent making some choice and being granted the quality of power. The difference from occasionalism is that this power gives the will real causal potency and can be spent in either of two choices, and thus it would seem preserves real free will. Let's go through the model. At any moment in which a person makes a choice, God creates a quality of power that the will uses to cause the action, which is also created by God. Hence, God remains the sole creator, but not the sole cause. In fact, it may be more appropriate to speak about divine action solely as timeless creation, according to Maturidi's, they stress the eternality of all of God's actions, and reserve the notion of cause for the necessary connections between things within the created order. So what about divine timelessness and the eternality of divine will and knowledge? Because you may be feeling, how can this match? How can it be if a human being really has a choice that God can, how can this be matched up with God existing out of time and being eternal in will and knowledge? It may seem that if God knows and wills the effects of choices from eternity, then there is a sense in which they are foreordained ahead of any human choice. The intuition here is that even if we grant what I've been saying, if God has timeless knowledge of all history, it may seem impossible for there to be any genuine choice. Isn't there really only one version of history frozen in place from before the beginning of the world, making our choices meaningless? I think that this idea is a misconception. Specifically, it comes from a failure to grasp what God's timeless action really means. If omniscience is affirmed as timeless, it should not be fed back as foreknowledge for a God that is posited at any point in time. God's timeless omniscience is the knowing that, well, part of what it knows is all the free actions of human beings are current in their respective moments. What God knows is the free choices that are being made as they are being made. If God uses this knowledge to write down every single such choice in the protected tablet, Al-Law Mahfuz, before the creation of the world, then what is being set down is precisely the actual free choices that are made in the points in the timeline. I freely make the choice right now to pick up this remote. Because I do this, then this is what God has, must have written in the decree. If I do otherwise, God would have written otherwise. The writing is based on his knowledge, and his knowledge is of my free action. The conditions under which my free action operates are based on lots of things. We're not entirely free in everything. So much of our lives are not within our freedom. And these are chosen by God's will as guided by his wisdom. But and also presumably free choices made by our parents and other people in our lives. But my choice between two options is free within the moment. When we come down to it, we've refined our initial contention. If divine wisdom, knowledge, willpower, and creative action are absolute, is it possible that God creates a being who can freely choose within time? If we answer no, we either compromise these attributes or eliminate freedom. I've tried to show how we might be able to say yes and divide an account of it. Have I performed my own sleight of hand? I must accept the human soul is created. So on what basis does it choose freely? I suggest the difference from the occasionalist case is that at the moment of selection, there is a real, as I've articulated it, not merely psychological free choice in causing an action. God wills to create the human's quality of power and wills a chosen effect, but does not make the choice for it over an alternative. God doesn't make that choice, we make the choice. When we are here talking about the soul, we're really talking about consciousness. This is a fraught and much discussed question within the philosophy of mind. In the present context, we are not so much interested in the metaphysical question of the soul, what it is, and how, for example, it may survive after death, but what it allows in terms of the specific experience of real choice. As we have seen, both of the Kalam schools we have been exploring, and in fact almost all proponents from the Islamic tradition, will grant that we have necessary knowledge of our own awareness and ability to make choices. The mystery of the hard problem of consciousness is not the fact of our consciousness, which seems to be staring us in the face, but in accounting for it within our scientific picture of the world. But remember, this is not what we are looking to do here. The strongest rational defense of free will has always been that we manifestly experience it. Our theories need to explain that fact. So the present model should be judged on whether it allows us to account for the freedom of a consciousness faced with a certain selection. The way it does this is to say that merely being a creation and possessing a certain power to cause one or other effect in no way forces which one is selected at a given moment of what we can call existential choice, to repurpose the idea of Sartre in quite a different way. It is in these constant moments of choice, of which relatively few may stand out as the gravest importance in our lives, from which the weight of moral accountability can hang. And this leads to another objection. What passionate desire or intellectual reason do I have to choose one thing rather than another? We don't just choose in abstract. We choose often conflicted by our desires, by our thoughts of what is best or what could be logical or sensible for us. So is our choice just a random or arbitrary decision? And if it's not, and it reflects actual reasons, then are these themselves not determined by who we are and thus undermine the idea of free choice? I mean, no one wants to deny that people have reasons, and reasons may often guide choices. But the point of freedom is that one may very well have every good reason to do something and still choose not to do it, perhaps from a desire, perhaps not, but that choice is there. Or to have every desire to do something but choose not, or just to choose not to act on desire at all. When the moment comes, all of these reasons and desires must be separated from the existential choice, and it's this and only this reality that can ground moral accountability. Thus, despite the complexity of the discussion of reasons, wants, and so on, and it has its place in ethics and psychology, it takes us out, strictly speaking, of theology. Without the basic grounding of a plausible account of free choice, it is all irrelevant, as we would just be slaves to whatever reason or desire God has willed to be dominant in our makeup in any time. To sum up, without in any way dismissing the seriousness of this theological problem, I do think it is one that can admit of a rational solution. My own preferred way of doing this is to maintain commitment to traditional Islamic theological ideas of God's timelessness, knowledge, power, and will, along with a specifically Maturidi construal of divine wisdom and eternal creative action. On the human side, acknowledging our freedom of our experience of freedom, we deny that this is an illusion and explain it within the theological framework that the above concepts allow, which includes a concurrentist account of human action. Once this reconciliation is in place, the divine decree, which is based on God's knowledge of what human beings choose, can be upheld. God knows our paths, but they are our own. Existential choice after existential choice, moment after moment.
thank you very much for that talk. I found it incredibly thought-provoking, and I'm sure many of you have your own questions to ask as well. So if we're free to do a little Q&A. So yeah, if any of you have any questions, please raise your hands and Dr. Harvey will answer.
Yeah, so yeah, very happy to try and answer questions if I can. Yes. Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm still trying to, this is part of a, some context. This, as I said at the beginning, is part of a wider project that's looking at theological anthropology, so looking at the human being and some of these questions. And I want to follow this chapter, I'm planning to follow the chapter on the soul. So I want to already have in place more of a theory of the soul and how, what, how does, what is consciousness, how does that work, or something like this. How can we account for this? So I don't think I can do it justice just really briefly, but I didn't have time to go into it here. But I think that the point I made in the lecture itself was that our starting point of knowledge is that we do feel that we have choice. So we know that we do have this, unless we're going to say it's actually illusory. And I don't like saying, I don't like an account that says it's not really there. It's just something we feel, but actually we're not really following real choice. There's no way to account for it. So then what does account for it? I think that we can say that, on some level, we're going to have to say that divine wisdom has given us options that we can take, and that we are able to cause, in that moment, we're able to cause, it's often given two alternative effects. We're able to cause one of two effects, right? We're not only able to cause a single effect, we're able to cause one of two effects. Now, at some point, maybe we can go further and give more of an account of exactly how this works. At some point, maybe the explanation will just sort of end. It'll be like, well, that's what we can do. And we know we can do that because we do it. But this is an explanation of that, rather than saying, well, whatever we're choosing is just what we're decreed to choose. And it just seems like we're choosing in a real sense, where the other option really could be affected by our actions. So yeah, it's a really good question. It does require further thought about the nature of the soul, which I can't really do. Can we go to, the back there? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So I think, in all things, you reach a point where you have to, you can't, there's a limit to our knowledge, there always will be. And so the question is, how much can we give? And some people distinguish between, they would want to say that, well, that ruh has been spoken about is something secret, but we still have, consciousness is something we can talk about, or mind, or there's different ways to look at it. But yeah, I think at some point we will not be able to explain further. but I think that if we can, we should try to, because this problem, the reason I was asked to come here today is because this problem is considered vexing. And it seems like, and it's a meaningful problem that always gets asked. And one of the answers is we just can't know the solve. But I think let's take the explanation as far as we can and try to put something in place that makes sense to our experiences. And then if at some point within that we have to stop short because we just certain elements of who we are and what we are just beyond our comprehension, then that's reasonable as well. And that's a religiously we could say that's actually commendable as well. So I think that's the way of the Kalam theologians as well. They would say, what we can say, we will say, and then when we have to stop, we will stop. So I don't see a problem with that. Further questions? Yes.
Actually, is damage. Very much even he really raised the issue that he's one of the very few Muslims who in centuries against slavery, the many people are stop short of announcing slavery and this term new was a bit abused in a very abusive way. I think we in the face it so we should move away from conformity. Maybe we should revisit it a little bit of everything and a little bit of morality. If you look at something that we have done, it was appropriate because that's people like John Locke or Descartes. So I think we should really afford to be critical of Asherianism rather than taking it as the basis of foundation. So,
Thank you for the comments. There's a lot there. It's a big counter narrative, and these kind of arguments are not unfamiliar to me. Personally, I think it's important to have a really good, critically informed understanding of the history of the schools of thought and their development, and also their interrelationship, and how much it's actually very clear to me how much of Sunni thought, not just responds to the Mu'tazila, but in ways builds on Mu'tazili models, but then brings that together with certain positions from the Hadith traditions and so on. So it's a very complex picture. And Asherism did develop a certain dominance, and in my work, by although I'm not particularly favoring the Mu'tazili school, by drawing on the kind of Maturidi tradition, which is this kind of, it's often being considered the kind of junior partner in the kind of Sunni theological schools, and particularly by going back to the earlier Maturidi tradition, I find there's very interesting positions that can be explored. So, for example, what I presented today about this concurrentist model, that's only from the very early Maturidi tradition that I'm really seeing that, and yet I think it's a very useful model to take into our consideration. So yeah, I do agree with some of what you're saying, but I maybe disagree on other elements. I think it's there's a chance to basically make a caricature of Asherism and its position, and not reflect the nuance of the Asheri tradition as well as a major school of thought. It's not all like Ghazali's thought. In fact, it goes through multiple stages and develops through time. But so it's an interesting question. I think the big question here is, and it's something that Muslims have been grappling with, is if we want to renew our intellectual tradition, if we want to renew our kalam or our theology in a meaningful sense, what sources should we be going to? How should we be reading these sources, and how should we be putting them into conversation with contemporary philosophies and thoughts? And where do we draw these lines, and how do we find a methodology for putting that together? And in that regard, I think it's a very rich area of, it's really a research program that's only beginning to get really started, I think, in recent decades. With other questions? Yeah, so yeah, back like that. What do you mean by because they're then they? Yeah. I mean, the thing that makes this topic so difficult is that we find it very hard to not think in terms of time. We're time-bound beings, and we live our whole lives in time and in space. And so when we try to, if we do take a view of God as not being limited by time, that completely changes how we think about it, and it does make it just really difficult to wrap our heads around, because something that I'm doing now and something that I'm doing in 10 years, God isn't experiencing a sequence in that way, right? Those things are both open to God. Everything's open to God at once. So, but does that mean it's not our choice? What God is seeing there, what God is knowing there, is still the choice. It's nothing. What else could it be but the choice? So this is really hard to wrap our heads around. But I do think that's the best prospect we have for resolving it. Some people don't like this idea, but I don't think, unless we're going to give up on God being outside of time, I think we need to have some account that goes something like that. Wallahu a'lam. Yeah, at the back. Right. So yeah. So the whole. I mean, I think everyone agrees that. Pretty much everyone agrees that God can't be made responsible for human evil actions, right? That's like the kind of everyone agrees on that, and it's clear in the Quran as well, that human beings are if there's evil, it's from your own self, or it's your responsibility. So I think everyone agrees on that, and the question is, well, how do you show that? And for the Mu'tazila, for example, what you do is you basically say, well, you basically even say God doesn't even create people's evil actions anymore. Humans in some sense generate their own actions, right? So what I've been trying to say is, no, God's will can still generate the actions, but the choice to do them is made by the human beings. Now, so I do think God has given the classic. This is a classic answer. It's not just dependent on Islam. Classic answer, of course, is that God, in His wisdom, gives people free will. And then there's a whole problem of evil of all, then people will do evil. And so you raise this problem of evil, you know, that if God is all powerful and and all good, the classic Christian problem of evil, they frame it as God is all good, God is all powerful, then how can we explain that evil exists in the world? And then the response to that is, well, there needs to be free will to realize a greater good or something like that. Now, in terms of Islamic thought, I don't think there's quite as much. You could say that of course God is good, God is merciful, but at least in terms of like the model I've been presenting from the Maturidi tradition, the core emphasis, the core attribute that he emphasizes is this idea of wisdom. So God is wise, and from God's wisdom is that human beings will be free and will be tested. And if they do good, they do good, and they'll benefit. And if they don't, then that's on them too. So I don't think this is necessarily a big problem. Of course, problem is a serious issue, and it's a whole area of theological study devoted to trying to answer it. But I don't think it's, I think in some ways the free will question is actually a harder question than the problem of evil for Islamic thought, I would say. So, I don't think it's solvable or insoluble, but of course it requires a lot of hard work and thought. I don't know if that fully answers what you were getting at, but that's something. Yeah, question.
Some limitations to how
Yeah, I mean, we'd have to specify what we mean by entanglement exactly and so on. I mean, it's an interesting thought. My immediate worry would be to not wanting to somehow put God's knowledge, into the world as an divine attribute, how you deal with that problem. But of course, God's knowledge is of the world. So this is interesting. I mean, in my book I've written, by the way, I can say now because I've finished the formal thing, I've written a book called Transcendent God, Rational World and Maturity Theology, and it's open access. So if you search my name on the Edinburgh University Press website, you can get the PDF for free. You can also buy it if you want to read it, or find it in the library. But in that book, I talk about some of these questions, and I do talk about particular relation to. I do talk about quantum mechanics as well, according to my knowledge, which is not as a knowledge of a scientist, but as a more of a theologian or philosopher would say. But one thing that I do talk about in that book is this idea of indeterminacy. That, and what I say about indeterminacy is, if there are things that are indeterminate, then that's not a problem for God's omniscience, because God knows them in their indeterminacy. He knows that they're indeterminate, and if that's part of what He's made, then that's part of what exists, and God can know that. But so I think the principle will be to affirm the absolute nature of the knowledge, but exactly what the knowledge is, and insofar as that relates to the world, then you can then describe that in different ways, and maybe then that's where some of these physical tools connected with how we're understanding the world could be helpful to better describe the kind of world side of the knowledge world relation. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's how I see it. But yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm not closed to the idea of revisiting some of these conundrums of questions in the light of contemporary philosophy. Personally, I think that's a very interesting thing to do. Further questions? Yes.
Well, I understand that how would you answer that?
Yeah. I don't know. I'd give the easy version of this. No, I try to. I think what I would say is so similar to what I've been saying, but in a kind of more simple way. So I'd say we know that we're free. We know that we choose things, and we don't know what we're going to choose, until we come to that moment to make that choice. But God's not like us. God's different, and God is not in time like we are. So whatever choices we're making at any point in our life, God knows those just as if we were doing, as if it was us doing it at that moment. But God is outside of that and can see all of it at once. But it doesn't make it less real, because what he's seeing is real choice happening, and that's happening because of his wisdom to allow that to happen. So something like that would be my explanation for my children or whatever. But I haven't raised this with them so much yet. Yes. So nothing. I've been focusing more on the kind of theological tradition. This is a really valid question. Exactly what was being said in the very first generations. From the Hadith that I mentioned earlier, they were saying the first people to discuss this, the first person to discuss this was Ma'bad. So it seems like from that it would be, it wasn't something that was initially being very much discussed, which, raises lots of interesting questions. And then some of these would be also entangled with how do we know what the earliest generation were discussing. We'll go through Hadith, which Hadith, should we be looking at here? As I said, the Hadith seems to present a more predestination-centric viewpoint than the Quran seems quite finely balanced, and the Hadith seems to be more explicit on that point. So does that reflect something that's particular quality of the Hadith? Which Hadiths are we talking about here? This is a big question. My impression would be that, and I haven't done a huge study on all the Hadiths in this and all the elements of it. But my impression would be that some of this more philosophical types of these philosophical and theological types of questions weren't asked in the very first generation, and then as people began to reflect, and just like other areas of theology, they started to ask these questions because people wanted to know. And also, they with Muslims, as Islam kind of spread from Arabia to other places in the world, and there was more of a contact with more, with these questions being asked for a long time in Christianity, in Judaism, in various philosophical traditions, and so there was more of a conversation started, and people would ask the Muslims, well, what do you say about this issue? Right? And one answer is to say, well, we say what's in the Quran and what the Prophet said. But people have always wanted to be able to give other answers that maybe are more, that will answer people's more like questioning, rational thoughts. And personally, I don't see any problem with that kind of discursive theology. Some people don't like it, and it's a legitimate view to say, I don't want to go into these things. Allah knows, and we don't need to know. I mean, I don't think that's a legitimate view. But I think that when people do ask that question, it is good to be able to give a more thoughtful, sort of philosophical answer that would maybe preserve what's important there. So yeah, so I can't fully answer in terms of the narrations. I haven't done that historical work, but it seems to me it's it's possibly something that's happening a couple of generations after maybe at the end of the late, what we saw in the younger companions may have lived to see the beginnings of these debates emerge. Other question? Yes, at the back. Sorry, can you do it? What's the utility of referring to theological traditions? Yeah, so there's different ways to, what I'm getting from this is almost the unsaid bit is, why not just do your own thing in your own way and not worry about what was said before, right? I don't know if that's, but yeah, okay, so I mean, I think there are different ways to kind of think about how to do theology today. And some of them refer more to tradition. I mean, some, you know, for some people, if you're not referring heavily to tradition, you've lost the kind of authentic connection to Islam, for example, or to the tradition of Islam. And some people will say, well, you're emphasizing that too much. How can we have new thoughts if you're indebted to these previous traditions? So you've got a spectrum of views. And to be honest, it's the same in Christianity. You say the same debates come with Christian theologians. Some people say, well, you're not agreeing with Orthodox Christian creed, and other people will say we don't need to. And so everyone's different on these things. Myself, I see a real benefit in being rooted in tradition, partly because my training has been also in, you know, early Islamic tradition and history of Islamic thought. But I do think that there are riches to be unearthed there, and it's about taking these riches, because these, you know, we don't want to. Sometimes these traditions are neglected and thought of as, well, that's all past. But you know, a lot of our best thought only proceeds because we stand on the shoulders of those that came before, and a lot of things that we can come up with have already been thought about or dealt with. So it's good to know at least what that is. And if we then at that point find in certain places it doesn't help us, then I think we can leave it. And you know, people will see this in my work as well, that in some places I just like go full on into like more contemporary philosophy of mathematics or something else, like, you know, other areas, and I'm not so beholden to what is being said. But I think particularly in things like the nature of God, you know, you want to have that connection to the earlier theologians, because they really did think about these things in a lot of detail. And some of these things don't necessarily change that much as well. Like these, especially on something like this is like a perennial problem. You know, there might be elements where we can say, okay, well, quantum mechanics is the frame that we can look at. But in many ways, this is the same debate, and we might use some new terms, but you know, it's not the fundamentals of our experience of free will and our belief in God and being all powerful, or so on and so forth. That's all the same, really. You know, it doesn't change that much with the changing of centuries. So therefore, I do think there's a lot that can be gained, and it's just a personal decision. I don't go against my colleagues who emphasize that less, but I do find it useful. Yes.
I mean, the sense that I think one of the things that we got on our section from things that you have to very easily what I mean. 10 years down the line, oh, the issue necessarily thinking that people also that have
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point, and it's a good also to give that, because I'm obviously quite keen on, you can see, quite keen on emphasizing the need to preserve the free will element, but there is a legitimate religious impulse for the idea of the divine plan. The worry, of course, is that then there's, you know, the worry is then the loss of that moral accountability. But in terms of the language question, I think this is the same for many areas of theology, and you know, not just free will. There's always this question of how much does language come in, how much are we falling short in language? And this whole linguistic turn became a big thing in Western philosophy in the 20th century, and so on. I mean, I think basically my take on all of that is that it's, you know, I hope it's not a cop-out, is that there's a certain extent in which language lets us down. There's a certain extent in which we can hopefully clarify concepts through better use of language. But it's not the case that because of that reality, you know, and the difficulties we have as beings suspended in language shouldn't stop us from trying to find meaningful theological solutions to questions either. If we just say, well, it's all just language, the danger is we fall into a kind of, sort of relativistic kind of, mode where just there's nothing but just our concepts that refer to other concepts, and we kind of just fall into this. I mean, I think that some of the recent thought on this, and I don't think that's useful. I think we need to, language is a tool, and we need to navigate it, but it's not, it shouldn't be a reason not to do substantive theology, in my view. Yes. In control of everything. What do you like to mean?
So what I'm saying is, so therefore God says that you do this, you're going to get killed. So God is like, why is the world?
Right, so what?
Otherwise, otherwise the world is going to get the sin of God controls everything. So with that bias, sort of adds weight to the fact we have free will.
Yeah, I agree that, in terms of the argument I've made here, I've argued that human beings do have free will and it's real. So God does not control the free choices that we make, right? Which is not to say that God doesn't have, absolute power. I've said absolute power, and so on, and all relevant perfections. But what I'm saying is that by virtue of his wisdom, he is giving human beings free choice, and you can see the terrible things people are doing to each other. But I don't see that as negating God's power. And even when people do these things, even I'm saying that God is creating all of this. So God is creating this. He's allowing people to make choices, and he's creating the results. So we're seeing what people. What does Allah say, that corruption appears on land and sea as a result of what your actions were, and something like this. People make choices, and Allah will show us the results. He'll give us the results in this life, and he'll give us the results in the hereafter as well, based on what we do. And that's from his wisdom. It's not, he could, if he wanted to, if that was what he wanted, he could have made us autonomous or something. It's not a failure to have that power to do that, but his wisdom, in my view, isn't that. His wisdom is something else. His wisdom has given us a free will for a meaningful purpose. And it's a difficult thing to want to discuss, but that's not possible. Yeah. No, sure. I can hear you.
Yeah, yeah, I might not be the right person to answer some of these, but what I would say is that we make a certain choice, or choices all the time, making choices. But exactly how what we choose plays out in the world, like sometimes we choose something, but it doesn't go according to how we think it will, or we're still free. The freedom's been preserved, but the result of that, exactly how it results, what then occurs as a result of that, the impact of that choice. A lot of these things are beyond us, and and in that way, I think we still can preserve free will in the sense of choice, and at the same time, so many things Allah is just doing without anyone choosing these things, but the way it's all coming together, right, is who, and so much of who we are, as I said, I did say this, that so much is not from our choice. There's only limited things that are. So some of these ways that things are orchestrated, that is within the divine plan, and we can say that. So I think but it's a fraught question, of course, and I don't know how we can, on a way, how what's the best way to deal with the feelings and so on. And your guess is as good as mine. We're all struggling through this life and trying to find a way forward. Yeah, right at the back. Yeah. I mean, yeah, to some extent. Obviously, it plays out as a. Remember, Allah. Yeah, Allah is not in time, so He's seeing the whole picture, the whole tapestry, and our choices are part of that. But it's not the only part, because not everything in the world is people making choices, let alone what those choices do and affect. So yeah, I mean, I'm just giving my, I'm just a academic who's trying to. I don't have all the deepest answers for you. I'm sorry, but I'm trying my best. But yeah, you have a second point. Okay. So the influence of shaitan. So I didn't really mention the devil, shaitan. In Islam, obviously, shaitan himself is a created being who is not an adversary to God, but a rebellious servant of God, right? And so shaitan, Allah says in the Quran, to the meaning that shaitan only has power over those who give him power. He will call you, he will tempt you, and if you follow, then he has power over you because you've followed a whisper, a bad thought. So I think that comes under in terms of the talk. We have various different desires, thoughts, and ideas. Now, shaitan will sometimes come and present us with a certain desire that is, we know it's the wrong choice, but the desire is strong, and so we follow what we know is wrong, and we're responsible for that, and we have to be told. So I think obviously there is a coming in the level of desire, or even like bad whispers, paranoia, different things that he might throw in there. It's one of the factors that comes into the human mind and is part of the environment in which we're making these choices. And this is part of the test. So it's pretty standard response. I'm not really accounted for it much in the theological side per se, but it's in there. I think we've got like a lot of questions. I think we're really slightly running out of time. I don't know if anyone hasn't had a question. I'll try to quickly. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, there's these different elements to this idea of cover. So there's some ways that you can talk about different levels of the decree and so on. But I would say there's a bottom line here. And the bottom line is that every dua that we're going to make, every action we're going to do, that's all ultimately accounted for so we do need the choice to make that dua, and the sincerity of that dua could be the thing that will lead us to that goodness that we need. But it's not something that God didn't know that we're going to make that dua, and then suddenly, we don't think God is going. I mean, according to the view I'm giving, some people might feel this, but according to the view I'm giving, if God is timeless, that's the assumption, that's the condition of this, or the presupposition I'm giving here. If God is timeless, then God obviously isn't caught by surprise by our du'as. So that's all kind of factored in at a higher level. But whether, you could have the angels, or, the different angels in the shoulders writing the books, and then they rub that out and replace it. And then let's go, there could be a whole, situation there. But if you take all of that back to ultimately the divine knowledge is perfect and complete, but I'm saying with also the freedom, and that would include the du'as we're making as well, part of the three choices. So worship, I think it's important that worship is preserved as meaningful. That's the, the danger of not having a meaningful account of this of free will is that people start to think, well, wherever I'm going to end up is where I'm going to end up. So there's no point doing anything now because it's all written, and then we give it all effort. If we think that, okay, every free choice to do good, that is making the good that's written for us. That's what God knows we're going to do. We need to, it makes us, we're active actors in this reality, and I think that's an amazing thought. So that's what we think on a intuitive level. But then sometimes when we start to hear about things like decree, we start to think, well, wait a minute, maybe it's just doesn't even matter and so on. So I think it's important to find a way to preserve it. Right at the back, there was a question. I think we'll get the last question. I mean, I hope that I've given some explanation of why I don't think it's a problem when God is considered as timeless. It's a problem if God is in time with us, right? Waiting for the future, and the future, that then becomes foreknowledge becomes a problem in that sense, but not otherwise. In terms of the direction of time, it does seem to be a reality of the world that there is a direction of time. So it's a really good question, which we can't get into maybe here. It will, strictly speaking, go beyond what we're doing here. But I would say that I would consider it to be from God's wisdom that he created time in a direction as such, that time seems to flow. And if you believe that God created the world from nothing, then that's a big debate as well in theology and philosophy. But if there was, in a way, the world is originated and then flowing into the future and potentially endless in the future, in terms of paradise and so on. So this is all from the divine wisdom to make a world like that, even if God himself is not in time. So I don't know, again, might be fully answering questions, but hopefully of interest to everyone. So I'd like to say thanks for all the engaging questions and thoughts. It's great to engage with you all here. I wish you all the best in your studies and in your in anything you're doing in terms of your lives and everything here. Love my parent.